Welcome to Life Stories, where we share extraordinary tales of resilience and courage. In today's story, we dive into the heart of Oak Ridge Park, a once peaceful community overshadowed by fear when the Iron Serpent's motorcycle gang took control. But what began as unchecked intimidation turned into an inspiring fight for justice. Led by a decorated Army veteran who refused to let her town be consumed by darkness. This is a story of strength, unity, and the triumph of hope over fear. Subscribe to Life Stories and join us as we begin today's compelling journey. Oak Ridge Park had always been the beating heart of our town. Nestled in the Midwest, it was a place where kids played freely, elderly couples strolled hand in hand, and families gathered for picnics beneath the towering oaks. It was, in many ways, the soul of our community, a refuge from the rush of modern life. But on that crisp autumn evening, as I ran my usual laps around the park, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I'm Captain Emily Carter, formerly of the U.S. Army Intelligence Corps. After 3 tours overseas, I returned to the town where I grew up, hoping to rediscover the peace I'd fought to protect. For months, Oak Ridge Park had been my sanctuary, a place where I could outrun the memories of distant battlefields and find solace in the rustle of leaves and the laughter of children. But that night, the park was eerily quiet. The usual chatter of skateboarders by the lot was gone, replaced by an unsettling stillness. Even the playground, usually alive with the squeals of young voices, stood silent. My footsteps echoed on the pavement, and the cool breeze carried the faint scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. As I rounded a corner, I saw Linda Price, a local teacher, hurrying toward me. Her face was pale, her expression tight with worry. "Emily," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "They're back. And it's worse this time." Linda's words sent a chill down my spine. For weeks, I'd noticed changes in the park, graffiti on the basketball court, broken glass near the picnic tables, and a growing sense of unease among the regulars. Rumors of a gang causing trouble had circulated, but this was the first time someone had come to me directly. I stopped and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Who's back?" "Linda. Tell me what's going on." She hesitated before rolling up her sleeve to reveal dark bruises encircling her forearm. "The Iron Serpents," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "At first, it was just noise revving their bikes, making people uncomfortable. But now they're demanding money from the food vendors. Last week, they cornered Mr. Thompson when he tried to stop them from harassing some teenagers. He ended up in the hospital." My heart sank. Mr. Thompson was the kind of man who had been a fixture in the community for decades, known for his generosity and kindness. The idea of him being hurt by these thugs filled me with quiet fury. "Have you reported this to the police?" I asked. She nodded. "They came, took some reports. But nothing changed. It's like the serpents know they'll get away with it." Before I could respond, the distant rumble of motorcycles broke the silence. I turned toward the parking lot and saw 5 of them rolling in, their engines roaring like a declaration of power. The riders were a motley crew, each wearing leather vests emblazoned with the gang's crimson emblem, a coiled serpent with fangs bared. Their leader, a hulking man called Cobra, staggered off his bike, laughing as an empty beer bottle rolled away. His crew fanned out, their movements practiced and deliberate. "Get inside the community center," I told Linda, my voice calm but firm. "Call Officer Daniels. Tell him what's happening." "But Emily," she said, clutching my arm, "these men, they're animals. No one can stop them." Her fear was palpable, and I met her gaze with steady resolve. "No one has stopped them yet," I replied. As Linda hurried away, I turned my attention back to the bikers. They weren't just drunk troublemakers, their formation and demeanor spoke of military training. These were men accustomed to control, men who thrived on fear. But they hadn't met someone like me. I watched as Cobra and his gang approached a group of teenage girls near the playground. The girls shrank back, their expressions frozen in terror. The sight was all too familiar. During my time overseas, I had seen bullies like these, men who preyed on the vulnerable, using strength to mask their own weaknesses. Not here, I thought. Not in this town. I stepped forward, my mind already mapping out scenarios and identifying tactical advantages. They're not alone, I called out, my voice cutting through the air like a knife. Cobra turned, his bloodshot eyes narrowing as he took me in. His sneer was almost comical as he sized me up, a woman in running clothes, standing barely to his shoulder. Well, he drawled, his voice slurred. Looks like we got ourselves a hero. Sweetheart, you should run along before you get hurt. I held my ground, my gaze unwavering. You made it my business when you started terrorizing kids in my park, I said evenly. You're leaving now. His amusement turned to anger, and he took a menacing step toward me. Maybe you need a lesson in respect, he growled. Before he could react, I moved. Years of combat training kicked in as I locked his arm behind his back and pressed him against a tree. The movement was fluid, precise, and almost effortless. Cobra's size and bravado meant nothing against the discipline and skill honed over years in the field. First lesson, I said quietly, keeping him pinned. Respect isn't earned through fear. His crew stood frozen, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. For the first time, they seemed to understand that they weren't dealing with civilians, they were facing someone who had seen far worse and emerged stronger. Behind me, the wail of approaching sirens signaled the arrival of law enforcement. As I released Cobra to the waiting officers, I glanced back at his gang. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice steady. You're going to cooperate. And then we're going to have a very interesting conversation about your activities in this town. For the first time that evening, Oak Park felt quiet again, not the oppressive stillness of fear, but the kind of calm that comes after a storm. As the bikers were led away in handcuffs, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The aftermath of the Iron Serpent's disruption lingered like the stale exhaust of their roaring engines. Although Cobra and his crew were in custody, a chill still hung over Oak Park. Fear, once a fleeting emotion in our community, now seemed rooted in the soil, like an invasive weed choking out everything good. I couldn't ignore the faces I saw on my next run through the park. Parents walked faster than usual, pulling their children close. Vendors who once filled the air with the scent of grilled food had shuttered their carts. Even Linda Price, usually so animated, seemed quieter when I saw her again near the community center. They let him go, she said, her voice tinged with despair. Cobra and the others. Just like that. I had expected it. The smirks they'd worn when Officer Daniels cuffed them hinted at more than just bravado. Men like Cobra didn't rely on fists alone, they leveraged connections, greased palms, and wielded fear like a weapon. They didn't just control people, they controlled the very systems meant to protect us. I had seen this before in far-off places. The uniforms might have been different, and the names unfamiliar, but the tactics were always the same. Corruption is a universal language, one I had spent years deciphering. And while I wasn't wearing a uniform anymore, I hadn't forgotten how to fight. It won't last, I assured Linda, though my thoughts raced. Letting them walk wasn't incompetence, it was calculated. Someone wanted them free, someone powerful enough to manipulate the process. Later that evening, I transformed my dining room into an operations center. The table was strewn with maps of the town, police reports I'd managed to pull from public records, and my own notes, sketches of Cobra's gang, their likely meeting spots, and their methods. I logged every rumor, every piece of hearsay from Linda and others brave enough to talk. One thing became clear, Oak Park wasn't the gang's endgame. It was a stepping stone, an ideal location to centralize their operations. Its proximity to major roads made it perfect for distribution. While it's tight-knit, unsuspecting community provided the kind of cover criminal enterprises thrived on. The serpents weren't just terrorizing the park, they were building an empire. The faint glow of my desk lamp cast shadows across the walls. And for a moment, I felt a pang of loneliness. There was no unit here. No platoon to watch my six. This wasn't the military, where loyalty was forged in fire. I had traded those bonds for the quiet civilian life I thought I wanted, only to find myself facing another war. But there was strength in the faces of those who depended on the park, the kids who would no longer play on the swings, the vendors who couldn't afford to pay protection money, and people like Linda, who had come to me despite her fear. They deserved someone to stand up for them. If I could pull an insurgent network apart halfway across the world, I could do it here. The next morning, I paid a visit to Officer Daniels. He was a good cop, and I hoped he hadn't been compromised. His tired eyes told me he was overwhelmed but not yet defeated. "You know they'll come back," I said, handing him a cup of strong coffee from the diner down the street. "They always do," he replied, his voice resigned. "But our hands are tied. Too much red tape. Too many roadblocks. You don't need to fight them head on," I said, leaning forward. "You need to outthink them." Daniels looked at me skeptically, but he listened as I outlined what I'd observed. How the serpents' movements mirrored military tactics, and how we could use their arrogance against them. "We don't just arrest them," I explained. "We document everything, every shakedown, every bribe, every violent act. We build a case so airtight it exposes the entire web of corruption protecting them." He took a long sip of his coffee, then nodded. "I'll see what I can do." It wasn't much, but it was a start. The real work would fall on me. Over the next few days, I worked quietly, watching and waiting. The serpents' brazenness was their weakness. They liked to flaunt their power, revving their bikes in the parking lot, scattering anyone who dared linger too long. I noted their patterns, the rhythm of their comings and goings, and the subtle way their presence drained the life from the park. I reached out to Linda again, asking her to quietly spread the word among the vendors and families. "Don't confront them," I told her. "Just keep your eyes open. Write down what you see. Together, we'll build something they can't ignore." When she smiled, a flicker of hope in her tired eyes, I felt the weight of my decision. This wasn't just about the park anymore. It was about showing a community that they didn't have to live in fear. As I walked back to my car, the rumble of motorcycles echoed in the distance. The iron serpents were circling again. But this time, I wasn't running. This time, I was preparing for war. The sound of the iron serpents' motorcycles became a nightly ritual. A reminder that they were always near. Each rumble seemed to echo their message, "This is our town now." But if they thought they were winning, they underestimated the resolve of a community fed up with fear and my determination to protect it. Linda wasn't the only one who had noticed the changes. Quietly, cautiously, others began to share what they'd seen. Mr. Alvarez, who ran the hot dog stand near the playground, told me how 2 bikers had demanded a weekly payment to keep his business safe. Mrs. Miller, who lived near the park, described men on bikes speeding down her street at night, their headlights off, as if they didn't want to be seen. Each account painted a clearer picture of the gang's methods, intimidation, control, and the creeping spread of their influence. But what struck me most was the silence that followed. Even as they shared their stories, these people spoke in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders as if the serpents were listening. Fear had taken root, and it was as destructive as any physical act of violence. The question wasn't just how to fight the gang, it was how to convince the community that they could fight at all. 4 days. I followed the bikers' movements, observing from a distance. Cobra and his crew weren't the only ones running the show. Their ranks were larger than I'd initially thought, with new faces showing up each night. Some were clearly seasoned men with sharp eyes and deliberate movements, likely former military or law enforcement. Others were younger, brash and reckless, eager to prove themselves. One evening, I spotted them gathering near the basketball court. Their laughter carried on the wind, but it lacked the warmth of camaraderie. It was sharp, edged with cruelty. I stayed in the shadows, taking mental notes. Cobra, always at the center, barked orders while his lieutenants, men they called Viper and Steel, spread out, their eyes scanning the park for any sign of trouble. But trouble was coming, and they wouldn't see it until it was too late. Back at home, I added to the growing map on my dining table. Red lines connected names, places, and incidents. Patterns began to emerge. Their activities weren't random, they were calculated. They started small, harassing vendors, breaking windows, demanding favors, but their endgame was control. Cobra wasn't just running a gang, he was laying the foundation for something much bigger. The more I studied their movements, the more I recognized their tactics. This wasn't just street-level chaos. It was strategic, mirroring insurgent behavior I'd encountered overseas. Secure the territory, silence opposition, and expand operations while the community remained paralyzed by fear. But just like insurgents, they had vulnerabilities, arrogance chief among them. That's when I realized the key to taking them down wasn't brute force. It was patience. I started small, enlisting a few trusted allies. Linda, of course, but also Officer Daniels, who'd become increasingly disillusioned with the lack of action from higher-ups. Together, we reached out to people in the community, vendors, families, even some of the older kids who used to hang out at the park. Quietly, we asked them to watch, to listen, and to document. Don't put yourselves in harm's way, I told them. But don't let them think they're invisible, either. Every detail matters. The response was cautious at first. People had lived under the shadow of the iron serpents for weeks, and fear wasn't easy to shake. But as the days passed, I saw a shift. A vendor discreetly slipped me a notebook filled with dates and descriptions of the gang's visits. A jogger shared photos she'd taken of the bikes parked near the playground. Even Mrs. Miller, who had seemed so frightened, called to tell me about a black van she'd seen idling by the park entrance late at night. Piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together. One night, as I reviewed the notes and photos, a name popped up again and again, the Rusty Nail. It was a dingy bar on the edge of town, the kind of place that kept its windows covered and its lights low. According to multiple accounts, the serpents frequented it regularly, using it as a meeting spot. It was a risk, but I needed to see for myself. I parked a block away and approached the bar cautiously. The sound of laughter and clinking bottles spilled into the street. Through the grime-streaked windows, I could see them, Cobra, Viper, and others I didn't recognize. They were relaxed, their guard down, which told me one thing: they didn't think anyone was watching. I lingered just long enough to confirm what I needed. This wasn't just a hangout, it was a hub. A place where plans were made and power was consolidated. As I walked back to my car, I felt a strange mix of emotions. The stakes were higher now, the danger more real. But so was the opportunity. The Iron Serpents thought they had this town under control. They didn't realize that the same fear they used to dominate the community would be their undoing. People were starting to fight back, quietly but steadily, and I wasn't going to stop until we reclaimed Oak Ridge Park. This wasn't just about taking down a gang. It was about showing an entire town that they didn't have to live in the shadows anymore. The Rusty Nail was more than just a bar, it was the Iron Serpent's nerve center. Over the next few days, I pieced together a clearer picture of its role in their operation. Vendors reported seeing gang members ferrying boxes to and from the back entrance. And one particularly observant teenager, armed with nothing more than curiosity and a smartphone, sent me photos of what looked like stolen goods. The serpents had become comfortable, even complacent, under the assumption that their control was absolute. But cracks in their empire were starting to show. It wasn't just their activities that concerned me, it was their growing presence. More bikers were arriving in town. And with them came an uptick in violence. A food vendor was roughed up for refusing to pay protection money. A group of teens was threatened for loitering too close to the park after sunset. Even Linda called one night, shaken, after spotting Cobra himself prowling near her house. "They're watching us," she whispered, trying to scare us back into silence. The weight of her words lingered long after we hung up. The iron serpents didn't just want compliance, they thrived on the fear that came with it. But fear is a double-edged sword. It isolates people, keeps them from fighting back. And that's exactly why it had to be shattered. I needed help. Officer Daniels became my anchor within law enforcement. Though his hands were tied by bureaucratic red tape, he still had access to resources I couldn't obtain on my own. Late one evening, over coffee at the station, we pored over surveillance footage from a nearby gas station that happened to capture the back entrance of the Rusty Nail. "What are we looking at here?" Daniels asked, his voice low. "Patterns," I replied, pointing at the screen. "Look at the times they come and go. It's not random. This is a supply chain. They're moving something, probably stolen goods. Maybe worse. They think they're invisible. But they're just predictable." Daniels leaned back, rubbing his temples. "This could take months to put together." "We don't need months," I said firmly. "We just need the right moment. When it comes, we'll be ready." While Daniels and I worked on the logistics, I focused on the people. Fear still lingered in the community, but I could see it slowly giving way to something stronger: defiance. Mrs. Miller, once timid and wary, began organizing her neighbors to keep watch near the park. Vendors, initially hesitant, started sharing more details about their encounters with the serpents. Even the teenagers, who had once scattered at the first roar of a motorcycle, began banding together to document the gang's movements. One night, as I walked through Oak Ridge Park, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. A group of kids, no older than 16, had returned to the basketball court. They weren't playing. Not yet. But they were there, standing together under the faint glow of a street lamp. Their presence was quiet, almost hesitant. But it was a small act of rebellion against the gang's reign of terror. I approached them cautiously, not wanting to startle them. "It's good to see you here," I said softly. One of the boys, tall and wiry, shrugged. "Someone's gotta take it back. Right. Can't let them win." His words stayed with me as I returned home. These kids weren't soldiers. They didn't have the training or resources I did. But they had courage. And that courage was contagious. The next morning, I met with Linda and a few others at the community center. We talked strategy, not just about watching the serpents, but about reclaiming what they'd taken. Mrs. Miller suggested organizing a neighborhood cleanup, a way to restore the park and bring people together. A vendor proposed setting up a weekend market to draw families back to the area. "We need to remind people this is our space," Linda said, her voice steady. "Not theirs." I couldn't have agreed more. The serpents had built their empire on the illusion of control. But illusions can be broken. By reclaiming the park, even in small ways, we would begin to dismantle the fear they relied on. As the meeting wrapped up, Linda caught my arm. "Emily," she said quietly, "you're doing more than protecting the park. You're giving us hope." Her words humbled me. I wasn't leading an army or orchestrating a grand battle. I was simply doing what I knew how to do, seeing patterns, identifying vulnerabilities, and fighting for what mattered. But hope alone wouldn't be enough. As I left the community center, I spotted Cobra and a few of his men near the parking lot, watching. Their smirks were gone, replaced by cold, calculating stares. They knew the tide was shifting. But they weren't ready to give up. Neither was I. This wasn't just about taking down a gang anymore. It was about proving to a town, no, to everyone, that fear doesn't last forever. And as the first hints of winter crept into the autumn air, I knew the storm was only just beginning. The early winter chill had settled over Oakridge Park, frost edging the bare branches and clinging to the grass in the mornings. The park was still quieter than it should have been, but there were signs of life returning. The cleanup initiative spearheaded by Linda and Mrs. Miller had drawn dozens of volunteers, scrubbing away the graffiti and repairing broken equipment. A small vendor's market had even popped up on a Saturday morning, with a scattering of families browsing stalls and drinking hot cider. But while the park began to heal, the shadows still lingered. The iron serpents weren't going to relinquish their grip so easily. Their presence remained a looming threat, their riders often circling the park in the evenings. One afternoon, a vendor's table was overturned by two bikers demanding payment. Though they were chased off by a group of volunteers, the act served as a reminder that the gang was still watching, waiting for the right moment to reassert their dominance. I had spent weeks documenting their movements and unraveling the threads of their operation. Cobra wasn't just leading a gang, he was managing an enterprise. The Rusty Nail was the hub. But it wasn't the only piece of the puzzle. There were connections, local businesses acting as fronts, delivery trucks making unregistered stops, and backroom meetings that hinted at something larger. Through all of this, Officer Daniels remained a steadfast ally, though I could sense his frustration. Every time we get close, it feels like they're one step ahead, he said during one of our late-night strategy sessions. It's like they know when we're coming. They probably do, I replied, flipping through the latest notes I'd gathered. If they've got someone inside the system tipping them off, it explains why they're so bold. Daniels sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. So what do we do? I paused, considering. We stop playing by their rules. If they expect us to come at them head-on, we hit them where they don't see it coming. The next day, I met Linda near the park. She had been my most trusted confidant in the community, her quiet strength a constant source of encouragement. As we walked along the path, she confided her concerns. People are scared again. Emily, she said. The cleanup helped. But every time the serpents show up, it feels like we're right back where we started. I stopped and turned to her. Linda, fear is their weapon. If we let it win, they've already succeeded. But the fact that people came to the cleanup, that they're still here, that means something. It means they're starting to believe. Her eyes softened, though worry still lingered. And if they're right to be scared, what if this fight just makes things worse? I didn't have an easy answer. The risk was real, and the stakes were high. But I also knew that allowing the serpents to rule through intimidation would only embolden them further. We're not alone in this, I said finally, and we're stronger together than they think. That evening, I returned to my makeshift operations center. My map of connections was becoming more complete with each passing day. The serpents weren't just running extortion rackets, they were smuggling stolen goods and possibly weapons. The Rusty Nail wasn't just their hideout, it was a distribution hub. And they weren't acting alone. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that someone else, someone with power, was protecting them. I spent hours reviewing surveillance footage and cross-referencing notes. The same names and faces appeared again and again, many of them tied to businesses and officials who should have been allies of the community. It wasn't just the serpents who had infiltrated the town, it was the rot that allowed them to thrive. And then I found it, a shipment schedule tucked away in a photo one of the teenagers had sent me. A nondescript van making stops at the Rusty Nail every Thursday night, just after midnight. It wasn't much, but it was a pattern, a crack in the armor. I called Daniels immediately. I've got something, I told him. If we time this right, we might be able to catch them in the act. Tell me where and when, he replied without hesitation. But as I hung up, a sense of unease crept in. The serpents were dangerous. Yes. But their protection network made them unpredictable. If we moved too soon, we risked tipping our hand. If we waited too long, they'd disappear into the shadows again. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the map on the wall. The stakes were higher than ever, and the risks weighed heavily on my mind. But as I thought of Linda's resolve, the teenagers reclaiming their basketball court, and the vendors refusing to give in, I knew there was no turning back. The Iron Serpents thought they owned this town. They didn't realize the fight was just beginning. Midnight on a Thursday. The world outside was hushed. The air crisp and laced with the faint scent of frost. I sat in my car parked 2 blocks from the Rusty Nail, the glow of its dim neon sign just visible in the rearview mirror. Beside me, Officer Daniels adjusted his radio, his face tense in the faint light of the dashboard. This was it, our first real move against the Iron Serpents. "You sure about this?" Daniels asked, his voice low. I nodded, though my pulse thrummed with anticipation. "The shipment's on schedule. If we intercept it here, we'll have something solid to start unraveling their operation. And if they're armed, they'll be armed," I said evenly. "That's why we don't rush in. We observe, document, and move only when it's safe." Daniels sighed but didn't argue. We had backup stationed discreetly nearby, a mix of trusted local officers and state troopers who had been briefed on the stakes. It wasn't a full raid, but it was enough to turn the tide if things went south. The minutes ticked by, and the faint hum of an engine grew louder. Right on schedule. A nondescript white van pulled into the alley behind the Rusty Nail. I grabbed my binoculars and watched as 2 men climbed out, their movements brisk and practiced. They opened the back doors, revealing crates stacked high unmarked, but suspiciously clean for a town this dusty. From the shadows, Cobra emerged, flanked by 2 of his men. They exchanged brief words, and then the unloading began. Daniels leaned forward, straining to see. "What do you think's in those crates?" he asked. "Could be anything," I replied. "Stolen goods, weapons, drugs. Doesn't matter right now. What matters is getting proof." I pulled out my camera and snapped a series of photos, capturing their faces, the license plate, and the crates themselves. Cobra's body language was calm, confident. He believed he was untouchable. But as I watched him laugh and light a cigarette, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about the crates. There was a deeper arrogance to his posture, as though he knew something I didn't. The unloading continued for another 20 minutes before the van pulled away. Cobra and his men carried the crates inside, disappearing through a steel door at the back of the building. I lowered the camera and turned to Daniels. "That's enough for tonight," I said. "Let's get these to the task force." As we drove away, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. The operation had gone smoothly, almost too smoothly. Cobra's confidence wasn't just bravado, it was calculated. He wasn't worried about being caught. And that meant one thing: he had someone on the inside keeping him informed. Back at the station, Daniels and I uploaded the photos and filled out a preliminary report. The crates were a lead, but they weren't enough to bring the serpents down. Not yet. We needed more evidence, more connections, more proof of the web that stretched beyond Cobra and his gang. The next morning, I stopped by the park. The cleanup crew had returned, their breath visible in the cold air as they worked to restore the flower beds. Linda spotted me and waved, her smile warm but weary. "Any progress?" she asked as I approached. "Some," I replied. "But it's slow. These things always are." Her gaze drifted to the playground, where a handful of kids were climbing the jungle gym. "They're still scared. You know, even when the serpents aren't around, the fear stays." I followed her gaze, my chest tightening. Fear had a way of outlasting the threat itself, burrowing deep into the psyche of those who lived through it. It wasn't enough to dismantle the gang's operations, we had to rebuild the community's sense of safety, brick by brick. That night, as I reviewed the photos and notes from the operation, a thought struck me. The Serpents' network wasn't just their strength, it was also their weakness. Every shipment, every meeting, Every bribe created a trail. If I could trace it far enough, it would lead me to the source of their power. And then it happened. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You're in over your head. Walk away while you still can." I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. The message wasn't surprising, but its timing was. Someone knew what I was doing, and they wanted me to stop. I typed out a reply, too late for that. As I hit send, I felt a surge of resolve. The iron serpents might have someone watching my moves, but they didn't know me well enough. Fear wouldn't stop me. It never had. And now, it was their turn to feel it. The stakes were rising, and the line between courage and fear was growing thinner. But I was ready to walk that line, one step at a time. The text stayed with me, its words looping in my mind like the hum of the iron serpent's engines. Someone was watching me. I had known this moment would come, but knowing didn't make it any easier. If the serpents were trying to intimidate me, it was a sign I was getting close to something they didn't want me to find. The message wasn't just a threat, it was a clue. The following days were a whirlwind of planning and observation. Daniels and I pored over every detail of the photos from the shipment, trying to find anything that could point us toward the serpent's larger network. The crates, though unmarked, were distinctive reinforced corners and a particular design that suggested they weren't ordinary storage. I sent the images to a contact in logistics, someone who had helped me decode supply routes during my military years. Their response came quickly. "These crates are military grade," the email read. "Common in smuggling operations overseas. Whoever's using them has connections." Connections. It was the word that kept cropping up as I unraveled the serpent's operations. They weren't just a gang terrorizing a small town, they were part of something bigger. Something organized. And the deeper I dug, the more I realized those connections extended into places I hadn't expected. One evening, while Daniels and I were reviewing shipment logs, he hesitated before speaking. "Emily, there's something you need to know," he said, his tone serious. "I've been hearing whispers, officers being reassigned, reports disappearing. Someone high up is protecting them." It wasn't a shock, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through me. Corruption wasn't just enabling the serpents, it was shielding them. But shields can crack. And I was determined to find the weak spot. The next lead came from an unlikely source. Mrs. Miller, who had been quietly observing the comings and goings near the park, called to tell me about a conversation she overheard between two of the serpents. They'd been talking about the old mill on the outskirts of town, a place long abandoned and easily overlooked. That night, armed with binoculars and a healthy dose of caution, I parked near the mill. The structure was dilapidated, its windows shattered and its walls stained with years of neglect. But as I watched, I saw the faint glow of lights through the cracks and the occasional shadow of movement. The mill wasn't abandoned, it was active. 2 bikes roared up to the entrance, their riders unloading more crates, identical to the ones at the Rusty Nail. I snapped photos, heart pounding, and noted every detail I could. The serpents were careful, but not careful enough. They were getting comfortable, and comfort bred mistakes. When I returned home, I laid the new photos alongside the others on my dining room table. The map of their operation was expanding, threads of red string connecting the mill to the Rusty Nail, and from there to other places in town. The web was intricate, but I could see the pattern now. The serpents weren't just operating in the shadows, they were deeply embedded in the town's fabric, hidden in plain sight. And then the second text came. "You don't know what you're dealing with. Back off, or it'll be the last mistake you make." This time, I didn't reply. Instead, I saved the message and forwarded it to Daniels. "They're escalating," I wrote. "We're rattling them." The next day, I brought the new evidence to Daniels and the task force. We couldn't afford to wait any longer. The serpents' operations were growing, and with them, the risk to the town. But more than that, their confidence was their Achilles heel. They thought they were invincible. They're using the mill as a secondary hub. I explained during the meeting. It's isolated. Easy to secure, but vulnerable if we hit it strategically. If we take it down, we'll cripple their supply chain. Daniels nodded. But his concern was clear. You know this isn't just about the mill, right? If we move on them, they'll retaliate. I know, I said. But if we wait, they'll entrench themselves even deeper. We spent hours planning the operation, coordinating with the state troopers and trusted officers who had remained untainted by corruption. The goal was clear: document everything, secure the evidence, and minimize risk to the community. It wasn't just about taking down the serpents, it was about dismantling the network that allowed them to thrive. As I left the station that night, the weight of what we were about to do settled on my shoulders. This wasn't just another mission. This was personal. Oakridge Park was more than a battleground, it was home. The faces of the people I'd come to know and care about lingered in my mind: Linda, Mrs. Miller, the kids reclaiming the basketball court. They deserved better than this. The serpents had turned our town into a pawn in their game. They thought fear would keep us in check. But fear is only powerful if it's allowed to fester. And come morning, we were going to prove that it had no place in Oakridge Park. This time, the iron serpents wouldn't see us coming. The morning of the operation dawned grey and cold. The kind of weather that seeped into your bones and made everything feel heavier. As I stepped out of my car near the old mill, I glanced at the horizon, where the sun struggled to break through the thick blanket of clouds. The air was still, charged with anticipation. The calm before the storm. Officer Daniels met me by the perimeter we had set up. His usual weariness had been replaced by a sharp focus. Teams are in position, he said, gesturing toward the hidden vehicles parked along the tree line. SWAT's ready to breach on your signal. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the mill. We had spent days planning this, making sure every detail was accounted for. The mill wasn't just a hub for the serpents, it was a keystone in their operation. If we could take it down, their entire network would start to unravel. But the serpents wouldn't go down quietly. Through binoculars, I watched as two bikers stood near the entrance, smoking and chatting. A third figure emerged from inside, waving them over to unload a truck that had just pulled up. They moved with an unsettling ease, completely unaware of what was coming. Remember the plan, I told Daniels. We need evidence. No unnecessary risks. He gave me a sharp nod. Understood. As the operation began to unfold, I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that always came before a mission. It was a fine line we were walking, one wrong move could jeopardize everything. But there was also a sense of purpose. A clarity that came from knowing we were doing the right thing. The first stage went smoothly. Officers in plain clothes moved closer to the mill, positioning themselves to block potential escape routes. The rest of the team waited in silence, their radios crackling faintly with updates. Then, with a single command, the breach began. The sound was deafening. The battering ram hit the steel door with a resounding clang, followed by the shouts of officers and the unmistakable click of weapons being raised. The serpents inside scrambled in confusion, their smug confidence dissolving in an instant. From my vantage point, I saw Cobra bolt toward the back entrance, only to be intercepted by two troopers. He struggled, but it was clear he knew the game was up. The crates we had seen earlier were pried open, revealing rows of neatly packed firearms, military grade, just as I had suspected. As chaos erupted inside, I joined Daniels near the perimeter. Cobra's caught, he said, his voice tinged with relief. And we've got the weapons. This is bigger than we thought. Bigger. Indeed. The discovery of the firearms confirmed what I had feared. The serpents weren't just operating locally. They were part of a larger network, one with dangerous ambitions. But even as I watched the operation unfold, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The crates were just one piece of the puzzle. We needed to find out who was supplying them and who in our town was protecting them. As officers secured the mill, I noticed something unusual: a sleek black SUV parked near the edge of the lot. It didn't match the Serpent's usual vehicles, and its tinted windows made it impossible to see who was inside. Before I could investigate further, the SUV started its engine and sped away. "Daniels," I said sharply, pointing toward the fleeing vehicle. "Get a team on that. Now." He radioed the order, but I knew it might be too late. Whoever was in that SUV had been watching, waiting, and they had just slipped through our fingers. Back at the station, the mood was a mix of triumph and tension. The weapons we'd confiscated were being catalogued, and Cobra's arrest was already making waves. But for every step forward, there were new questions. Who was funding the Serpents? How deep did the corruption go? Daniels sat across from me, exhaustion etched into his face. "We've dealt them a serious blow," he said. "But you're thinking the same thing I am, aren't you?" I nodded, staring at the photos spread across the table. The crates, the faces, the SUV. This isn't over. Someone out there is pulling the strings, and they're not going to stop. As I left the station that night, I walked through Oak Ridge Park, the place where this fight had begun. The park was quiet, but not lifeless. A few families lingered near the playground, their laughter carrying softly on the breeze. It was a reminder of what we were fighting for, not just to dismantle the Serpent's operation, but to restore something far more important: hope. The Serpents had underestimated this town. They thought fear was enough to keep us subdued. But fear can only last so long when people begin to stand together. The mill was just one battle. The war was far from over. But as I watched the children play, their laughter untouched by the darkness we'd faced, I felt a spark of determination. We were winning, and I wasn't going to stop until the Serpents and their shadowy allies were nothing more than a memory. As the last of the Iron Serpents were led away in handcuffs, the sun broke through the clouds over Oak Ridge Park, illuminating a town that had endured fear and emerged stronger. The gang's empire, built on intimidation and corruption, was dismantled piece by piece, exposing the shadowy figures who had enabled their reign. The mill, the rusty nail, and their network of connections were no longer untouchable secrets. The park, once a place of fear, became a symbol of resilience. Families returned, laughter filled the air, and the faint hum of hope replaced the roar of motorcycles. For me, this fight was never just about taking down criminals, it was about reminding a community of its strength. Oak Ridge Park wasn't just reclaimed, it was reborn. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more tales of courage, determination, and the power of community.